This weekly series of short performances is brought to you by the Gilboa Historical Society and made possible by a grant from the New York State Council on the Arts. This week we present storyteller Nancy Marie Payne's American Aviatrices. Women pilots in the early 1900s had to handle prejudice as well as their aircraft. When a man died in an aircraft, it was a shame, but he knew what he was getting into, and he was a hero for breaking new ground. When a woman died in a plane accident, it was proof she shouldn't have been flying in the first place.
Hello, I'm Nancy Marie Payne. I'm with the Story Circle of the Capital District. Our headquarters is in Proctor's, and I'm a storyteller. I would like to share with you an event that happened in November, but I'll get to that. We'll have some build up here to begin with. I want to take you back to 1783, when the first manned flight, 1783, in France, a balloon. The first time a human being left the earth for any period of time and was in control. Well, okay, let's go back a few hours, because the first one did not have a person in it. The first balloon up took up a sheep, a duck, and a rooster. If they came down safe and alive, then they'd send up a man, which they did later in the afternoon. This was a tethered flight. And tethered flights were the thing for a while. But eventually, they untethered. And that was marvelous. Then a woman went up for the first time the next year, 1784. It isn't recorded what her name was, but she had a good time. I think they told more about how she was dressed than they bothered to tell about her name. During the Civil War, balloons were in use by the Northern Army. The men would get in the balloon before sunrise so that it could get up there out of rifle range before the sun came up. And they were forced to stay up there all day long until the sun went down, when they were brought back down. One of the pilots of one of the balloons said he was the most shot at man in the Civil War. In 1903, the Wright brothers were credited with the first powered flight. Look at the distance in time, 1783 to 1903. Well, of course, the Wright brothers set this whole thing into flight, and it took off. Excuse that, I can't avoid these things. Of course, it was all men. And all of the records were set by men. The big thing was the barnstorming, where a pilot would fly his plane into a field, get out, contract with the farmer, who would let the plane go in the barn during inclement weather, and then they would put on an air show in the farmer's field, and the take would be split between the pilot and the farmer. This happened before the World War, but it also became very popular after World War I, when we had a surplus of airplanes that were selling, still in their boxes, for next to nothing. But there were women who wanted to do this too. They wanted to get in on this thrill, this edge of adventure, and they were not permitted. One woman's name was Blanche Scott. And Blanche Scott was a self-proclaimed tomboy. She loved anything mechanical. She lived on the East Coast. And there was a motor car company on the East Coast who wanted some recognition. And so they hired Blanche to drive one of their motor cars from the East Coast to the West Coast. And the advertising was, "It is so safe, it is so easy, even a woman can do it." Well, when she was in and she was bitten by the flying bug. She finished her contract with the company and came back to live in the East Coast. Glenn Curtiss was a pioneer airplane builder, and he had a factory, and he was well known for his airplanes and his teaching of men to be mechanics, to be pilots. The company had grown so that he was no longer the sole owner. It was now owned by a board of trustees. Glenn Curtiss was a chauvinist. Women were not to have anything to do with his endeavor. But the board outvoted him. They saw the publicity for this car company, and they wanted to hire Blanche to give the same recognition to an airplane. Glenn Curtiss was furious. No, well, sorry, Glenn, you're outvoted. And so she was to go to his flying school. Well, he tolerated her as long as they were in the classroom, where she excelled. But the minute they went out into the field to have practical work with the planes, she didn't pass. The men moved on, the next class came in, and she's still there. If you've had experience with stubborn women, or even a stubborn man, you know that they can be pretty annoying. And so she got to him. And finally he said, okay, you can go out and you can taxi around the field. That's all. That's all. Don't bother me after that. And so she went out and she taxied around the field. Now the next part of this story is up for debate. Some people said Glenn Curtiss put a block of wood under the accelerator so the plane could never reach speed. Other people said she knew he did it and removed it. And other people said she didn't know he did it. Everything that happened just happened. And what happened was, as she was taxiing around the field, he'd come out every 5-10 minutes and yell at her, slow down, you took that curve too fast, get the tail off the ground, don't go over that bump again, you'll rattle my plane to pieces. And then he heard screaming from the men outside. She's in the air! She's in the air! And he comes out, and sure enough, she's in the air. And she's flying, solo. The first woman to do so in America. France is way ahead of us. She did not get the credit for that because it was not expected. It was not official. There was no one there to record it. And so when she finally landed it with only the slightest of bumps, he had to begrudge her the fact that she did okay. I don't even think he ever told her. But he did keep her on, he did teach her, and he swore she would be the only woman he would ever teach. So this is in 1910. And she goes on and makes a name for herself, but she got bored with it. She said, people come out to see the freak fly a plane, waiting for me to crash. I'm tired of being the country's freak. And she went on to bigger and better things. The first woman to be accredited with being a solo pilot was also in New York State, and her name was Betsy Raith. Betsy was brought up in France, where women were allowed to do these things, where she married her husband, who was a very liberal-thinking man. And the two of them came back to Long Island, took up residence, and built a plane in their living room. It was just a frame of a plane, as they were back then, totally open. But she got her license and was accredited as the first woman to fly solo in the United States. There are other women coming up, and one of them was Ruth Law. And like Blanche, she was in it. She wanted to have adventure, to try this new fangled thing, to take it on. And she became a stunt pilot. Let me describe her plane to you. 2 wings, a biplane, a chair bolted to the bottom wing. Behind that chair, the gas tanks. Behind the gas tanks, a propeller pointing backward. Between her legs, a stick to fly. A piece of metal to hold her feet, something to brace against. That was it. That was it. I call it a chair in the air. In that chair in the air, which she called Babe, she learned to do loop-de-loops. She flew at night with lights and phosphorescent flares. She was part of the celebration when the Statue of Liberty was lit for the first time at night. She had a name for herself, but she wanted to break records. And so she arranged to be the first woman to go the highest, the altitude record, which was set by a man. And she got over 11,000 feet in the air, but still did not break the record of the men, which infuriated her. The first thing that infuriated her was that there were separate records. Why can't there be a record for the first person to do this, not a separate record for men and women? She didn't get very far with that argument. Now, Ruth was not a feminist, was not a suffragist, as most of these women weren't. They were too involved in flying and what they wanted to do to take on the responsibility of the movement. And so she contracted, she was going to fly from Chicago to New York City, break the distance record. She had 2 wool suits, 2 leather jackets, and a skirt. That was what women wore in public, a skirt. When she got on the plane, she took the skirt off and stowed it. But when she landed, she put the skirt right back on. She went to Glenn Curtis and wanted to buy a bigger, better plane, something that was enclosed. He wouldn't sell it to her. He said a woman could not handle a bigger plane. And so she was going to do this feat in Babe, the biplane, the chair in the air. She went to Chicago, and there she had her mechanics working on the plane. She rented a room in a hotel, but had a tent built on the roof of the hotel so that she could acclimate herself to the November climate, the connection with the seasons for my story. On the morning of the flight, she got up before dawn, went down to the beach, and intended to take off immediately at sunrise. The plane had to be refurbished to make it a long distance. And so the gas tanks, bigger gas tanks, were put in behind the chair. She now had 53 gallons of gas. What she expected was when she got up in the altitude, the western wind would blow her east and help make up better time. When she got down to the beach, they had taken the lights off her plane to make room for all this weight of more gasoline. And so now she had to get to New York before sunset. The winds were awful that morning, and the cold was so cold they couldn't get the plane started for over an hour. Her mechanics tried to talk her out of this. Wait for another day. We can get you off earlier and the wind won't be so bad. But she said, the wind is my friend, it's going to push me. She prevailed. She got in the plane and it just was side to side. They were afraid the wings were going to hit the ground, hit the water. Her mechanics actually cried. She expected to get high, but the winds died down. She now had no wind to push her. Now she's in a chair in the air. She's got no place to put a map. And so she came up with this ingenious invention. She took a cardboard box, she cut the map that would go from Chicago to New York, and put it on a roller, strapped it to her leg, and then rolled it so that she could follow the streets and the highways. There were no aviation maps then. And this is how she would go, from city to city. In order to do that, she couldn't get much above a mile to see where she is. And there's no wind to help even up above, so why not stay at a mile up? Her average speed was 100 miles an hour. She got as far as Hornell, New York. Now, the newspapers had touted this, and the wires were rattling, telling where she was and how she was doing. So people all along the route are waiting to see her go by and wave. And then they see the plane going lower and lower as it's coming toward Hornell. It actually had no gas at this point, and she is gliding in. Well, the people in Hornell, and if you're not familiar with New York State, Hornell is at the tip of Lake Cayuga. So she's come 590 miles. She's broken a distance record, all right here. But she's got no more gas. All this wasting of time, the having no tailwind has made her land here. So she stops the plane. She had almost hit people in the field because they were so excited they ran toward her, but she landed safely. She got out and she was frozen. Her fingers were frozen. Her body was stiff, but she did get that skirt on. They took her into town and they took off her gloves very slowly because the fingers were blue, and they saw written on the glove numbers. And they said, what's this? And she said, well, those are my compass points. She had a compass, a watch, and an altimeter. Those were her only instruments which she could put in her pockets, and this. So that gave rise to the expression, flying off the cuff. In Hornell, I love the way these old newspapers, she ate ham and eggs and toast and coffee. This is part of the news report, big headlines. It's over an hour before she can take off again. Fully charged, all the gas she needs. She takes off and she starts again toward New York. But she's lost over 2.5 hours with all the delays. And she knows she can't get to New York before the sun goes down, and she can't land without lights. And so she's forced to land in Binghamton. And there again, they're not expecting her to come down, so they're thinking something's wrong, she's in trouble, and they're all on the field with the fire extinguishers and all this, but nothing was wrong. She again got out, put that skirt on, and was offered a room and a bed by strangers where she slept the night. The next morning, she took off and finally got to New York. This is in 1910. And she had broken the record. 590 miles was a record breaker for women, and another woman broke it the next year. During World War I, she offered to join the Army Air Force, but she was turned down. But she was given a uniform by the government and allowed to go from city to city and raise war bonds and to promote the war. She was invited to go to Canada, where she was invited to teach the Canadian pilots, which she did. And after the war, she continued her barnstorming. She went on tours all around the world to promote flying independence for women. By then, the 19th Amendment had been signed, and she was on board there. So nothing bad ever happened to her. Her husband often was close to a heart attack from watching the things she did. One of her stunts was to fly a plane over a moving car, and another woman would come down a ladder from the plane and get into the car from the moving plane. And her husband was sure that she was going to crash. So one day he decided to tell the newspapers, I got a story for you. My wife's retiring. And she knew nothing about it until she landed. But she said, it's time. There's too many regulations now. Everything's being put in a box. You've got to do it this way. You've got to do it this way. You've got to do it this way. And all the fun is gone out of it. And so she retired and raised a family. Thank you.